Hello everybody, welcome back to the Flix Files. It's James Bond time again. I love James Bond. I've never made a secret of the fact that I'm a huge James Bond fan. And there's already a number of videos on my channel where I talk about the Bond movies in various ways. I did a video where I tried to rank the best fight sequences, and I did a video where I tried to rank the best pre-title sequences. So I wanted to come up with an idea to do another Bond video, and I think I've got one, and I think it's going to make for an interesting talk. And the question that I came up with to ask myself is, what is the best Bond movie for action? If you're an action movie lover, and for whatever reason, maybe you've never seen a Bond movie, what would be the perfect Bond movie to watch as an introduction that would win you over with all the action that it contained therein? So that's the question we're going to answer in today's video. So let's get started.
Absolutely. There's no sense in going off half-cocked.
So as always, whenever I do a Bond video, I tend to set myself some ground rules just to make it a little bit harder. The first of which is, whatever movie I pick, I'm only going to choose it from the original run of Bond movies. So that's the 16 Bond movies from Dr. No right through to License to Kill. I'm not going to include any of the newer Bond movies from GoldenEye onwards. Now you probably think that's silly. Why would I do that? Well, there's a good reason for that, because from the 90s onwards, visual effects started to get a lot better in movies, and advancements in stunt work were getting better. And if I was to do a video just about Bond action, it would be very easy for me to just focus purely on the more modern Bond movies starring Pierce Brosnan and Daniel Craig, and just kind of forget about all of the older classic Bonds. But they're the movies that I grew up on, so I wanted to try and pick my selection from that original run of movies. Maybe in the future I will do another video with the same topic, but I will just focus on the more modern Bond movies. The second rule is, whatever Bond movie I pick, it has to have all of the Bond action tropes. So you're probably thinking, well, what are the Bond action tropes? Well, let's quickly go through them now. So the first trope is a vehicle chase sequence. There have been many, many vehicle chase sequences over the Bond films. Whether Bond is driving a car, whether he's driving a motorbike or a speedboat, the movie has to include a chase sequence. So that's the first one that we need to tick. The second trope is there has to be a sequence on skis. This is another kind of recurring stylistic action sequence in Bond movies. There's usually, not every movie, but there's usually a ski sequence that can be very exciting. So we want to include that as well. The third one is an underwater sequence. What could be more dangerous than being in peril underwater with all the added dangers that that involves? So we want to include that as well. The next one is a near-death escape. It's always good in a Bond movie when he's put into a very, very perilous situation and he has to kind of think his way out of it and come up with a unique way of escaping. So we definitely want to include that. The next one is an obvious one. We need kind of shootouts or a big fight sequence. Something like that, something more physical, with Bond actually getting into the thick of the action. And finally, we need a kind of an aerial sequence. So that's got to be something that involves height, whether he's on top of a tall building or he's hanging from something that's really high up, but something that's got that danger involved with it. So they're the 6 Bond action tropes that we need to cover in whatever selection I pick. And those are the rules that I've set myself. So, what movie have I chosen? And I'll give you my reasons why.
This never happened to the other fella.
So, before we get into ticking off those action tropes, I want to introduce the movie that I've selected. And the movie that I think offers the best action for a newbie to the Bond franchise is 1981's For Your Eyes Only.
For your eyes only can see me through the night.
And this was smack bang in the middle of Roger Moore's tenure of James Bond. And it's also the first movie that was directed by John Glenn. And John Glenn did such a cracking job with this film that the producers gave him the next 4 Bond movies after this to direct. So we had a really good run of Bond films throughout the 80s. And John Glenn has a really long history with the Bond franchise, going all the way back to, I think it was on Her Majesty's Secret Service. And he was a second unit action director. And he was primarily involved with the big action sequence at the end where Bond is fighting Blofeld as they're flying down the bobsleigh. And he also had involvement with the pre-title sequence of The Spy Who Loved Me, where Bond skis off the top of that mountain and then opens his parachute with a big Union Jack on it. Terrific sequence. And of course, he had a massive hand in the pre-title sequence to Moonraker, which is just an incredible piece of action cinema. And in the video that I did about pre-title sequences for James Bond, I picked this one as my #1 choice because it's just incredible. So we know that For Your Eyes Only is in safe hands and that we have a very capable action director in charge. And hopefully by the end of this video, you will agree with me that For Your Eyes Only is just a terrific Bond film as an introduction to the action that's available in this whole franchise. So let's start ticking off those tropes.
I'm afraid we're being outhorsed.
So the first trope is vehicle chase sequence, and For Your Eyes Only has an absolutely cracking car chase. And what makes this one so special is that near the beginning of the movie, his white Lotus Esprit that he's driving, and you think this is the car that he's going to be using in some sort of an action sequence, gets destroyed because somebody tries to break into it. And apparently this scene caused a big laugh when this movie was in the cinemas because car theft was very high at that time, especially in America. So to see somebody trying to break into Bond's Lotus Esprit only to have it completely explode and kill the wannabe thief caused a big laugh, but it destroyed his car. So when we get to the part in the story where they're being chased by some bad guys, he has to drive the car that's owned by the Bond lady in For Your Eyes Only. And just as a little side note, the Bond lady is the actress Carol Bouquet, and she is gorgeous. I think out of all the Bond films, Melina Havelock in this movie is just gorgeous. She's got the most beautiful jade green eyes. And anyway, I'm getting sidetracked. But she drives a little De Chevaux, a little Citroen 2CV, which is probably the least likely car you could ever imagine Bond using in a car chase. But that's what makes this sequence so fun. And we get this extended chase sequence where they're getting chased down this kind of very narrow hillside road, and they're getting bashed into, and the Citroen 2CV gets knocked off the road at one point and rolls over many times and lands back on its wheels, but it still manages to keep running, and it just ends up being a complete wreck by the end of it. But he makes it work. Bond uses his driving skills to outwit the baddies. And they manage to make their escape, and it's just a terrific action sequence. So action trope number 2 is something involving skis and snow. And For Your Eyes Only has probably the best ski action sequence that you're ever going to see in any Bond movie, even including the modern versions. And the sequence is set in Cortina, where Bond is being shadowed by some bad guys that are out to kill him. So he's trying to evade them. And he gets into a lift that takes him to the top of an actual ski jump. And he skis down the ski jump in order to evade these baddies. And another baddie gets on the ski jump with him, and they're fighting as they're going down the ski jump. And he manages to beat that bad guy. And then as he lands and he continues to ski down the mountain, he starts getting pursued by other bad guys on motorcycles that have spikes in their wheels and front-mounted machine guns. So they chase through the woods, and Bond's trying to fend them off, doing various things. And he eventually ends up skiing into a bobsleigh run. And so not only is that exciting enough seeing Bond on skis in a bobsleigh run, but the motorcycle gets in there as well. He's being chased by a motorcycle going like batshit crazy down a bobsleigh run. And it's glorious. And the whole sequence is probably, I would say, 5 to 10 minutes long, and it's absolutely fantastic. And when I first saw this movie way back in the early 80s, it was this sequence that stuck in my mind for many, many months afterwards. It was so great. So the third Bond action trope is something involving underwater, which brings that added element of danger. And I always find these sequences exciting because I'm slightly thalassophobic. I always get very nervous around deep water. And in the movie, the MacGuffin is a thing called an ATAC device, which if I remember correctly, stands for Automatic Targeting Attack Communicator. And to me, it just looks like a 1980s cash register that you would have seen in Tesco's. But at this point in the movie, the device is inside the wreck of a sunken ship in deep water. And Bond and Melina Havelock have to go down into this wreck to retrieve this ATAC system. You're already nervous because you're aware that they have to do this on a limited supply of oxygen. But what they don't know is the baddies are after them again. And the main baddie is wearing this big heavy-duty deep-sea diving suit. And there's a little fight sequence that happens underwater, and Bond ends up putting some explosives on the back of the guy's suit using a magnet, which makes him explode. Obviously, the concussion of that affects them while they're underwater. And it's a great sequence that ramps up the tension, and I find quite hard to watch, but it's great, and it's a lovely, exciting moment right in the middle of the film. So the fourth action trope is the near-death escape, and probably the best one of these in For Your Eyes Only is where Bond and Melina are captured by the bad guy, played by Julian Glover, and he ties them together using some rope and then throws them off the back of his large power yacht that he has. And the idea is that he's just going to drive the yacht backwards and forwards, dragging them through the water, where they're catching on all the coral that's under the water. And they will eventually either just be cut to shreds and eaten by sharks, or they'll drown. Well, Bond manages to escape this by diving under the water and wrapping the rope around a large rock, and just using the law of physics to try and get on his side and put added pressure on the rope that's tied to the power yacht. And eventually the rope can't take the strain anymore and breaks with such force that it knocks one of the guys off the yacht. And it's, again, a very exciting sequence that involved some pretty dangerous stunt work. It looked like they really did drag some stunt people through the water at high speeds. And the thing I always find incredible whenever I watch this sequence is that for the close-up shots of Bond and Carol Bouquet, they weren't actually under the water. They just kind of filmed them in slow motion with a fan on them to wave their hair around, and then just added bubbles and things in the foreground. But it works so well, and even though I know when I watch this movie that at that point they're not actually wet, they're not under the water, it still has a lot of believability to it. So the fifth action movie trope is a good shootout and fight sequence. And this movie has a pretty large shootout, which involves them going into a warehouse where they discover that there are large barrels of opium being stored by the main bad guy in the movie. So there's a large shootout that happens in this warehouse, which ends up getting deliberately destroyed by one of the bad guys in order to hide the evidence, and Bond almost gets killed in a huge explosion that occurs. And he manages to chase one of the main bad guys who gets into a car, and he chases him up a mountain road where the bad guy loses control and his car ends up perilously hanging off the edge of a cliff. And it's one of the few times in the Bond franchise where James Bond is out for vengeance, because earlier in the movie this guy killed one of his aides earlier in the film by slitting his throat, and Bond kicks his car off the edge of this cliff and makes him fall to his death. And again, it's a pretty long, elongated action sequence involving guns, fighting, explosions, and it's just great. And it easily ticks the 5th action trope. So now we get to the 6th Bond action movie trope, the final one, and it's something involving an aerial sequence. Well, For Your Eyes Only has 2. And the first one is the actual pre-title sequence of the movie, which is just glorious. And it's where Bond is inside a helicopter, and what he doesn't know is the helicopter will be remote controlled by Blofeld from down on the ground in his wheelchair. And Blofeld electrocutes the pilot and then takes the controls of the helicopter. And Bond has to kind of climb out of the helicopter in order to get round and sit into the pilot's seat. And then he manages to pull the wires to break the remote control connection that Blofeld has. And it's an incredibly exciting sequence. Again, the only special effects involved in this sequence was like back projection when we get close-ups of Roger Moore. But all of the wide shots of the helicopter flying around with a stunt guy hanging on the side are just absolutely incredible. And the sequence ends where Bond uses the kind of landing struts of the helicopter to pick up Blofeld, and he then unceremoniously drops him down a chimney pot. And it's a fantastic aerial sequence. It's really good. But the movie doesn't stop there, because the final action sequence of the film involves an assault on the baddies' headquarters, which is sat right at the top of a very large and very steep mountain, a big kind of chunk of rock. And I think it's one of the few times, if not the only time, that we see James Bond actually flex his mountaineering skills, where he's trying to ascend the side of this large rock in order to get to the base at the top. And as he's about 2/3 of the way up, one of the bad guys notices that he's climbing up the side. So he then starts to come down himself and begins to smash away at the hooks that he's knocked into the side of the mountain in order to try and make Bond fall. And it's a really exciting sequence that really plays on my fear of heights. And there's just a terrific stunt that was filmed by the guy that did the ski jump at the beginning of The Spy Who Loved Me, where Bond is almost at the top of the rock, and what he doesn't realize is that there's a bad guy there waiting for him, and the bad guy kicks him and makes him lose his grip, and he ends up falling off the side of this mountain, and he only has the strength of the rope to break his fall. So he falls, and then he very quickly stops, and it's really jarring. And it's all done in camera. It was an actual stunt, and it's just incredible. And it's just a great, great sequence.
Give us the kittens! Give us the kittens!
Well, really, Mr. Bond.
And that, ladies and gentlemen, is my case for why I think For Your Eyes Only is the best Bond movie for out-and-out action. As you'll see, it ticks all of those Bond movie tropes. And I think you'll be hard pressed to think of another Bond movie that does that has all of these in there. If there is one, please let me know. But to me, this is the Bond movie that kind of has it all. And it's a really good sort of primer for people that are new to Bond movies, that love their action. Again, just to reiterate what I said at the beginning of the video, there was a reason why I've omitted the newer Bond films from my selection, because if I was to include them, then I would probably end up picking a movie like Tomorrow Never Dies, which has probably my most favourite action sequence out of all the Bond films, which is the sequence where Pierce Brosnan is driving that BMW using his phone sat in the back seat as he's ascending through a multi-story car park. It's just an incredible action sequence. But that sequence and that movie highlights what I was saying about the advancements in stunt work and mechanical effects and special effects. And it would be just very easy for the modern movies to just completely wipe out all of the older classic Bond films. But I'm an old git and I'm very nostalgic, and I have such a fondness for those original 16 films that I had to make my selection from them. So I hope you'll forgive me. So I hope you enjoyed that. If you did, give me a big fat thumbs up. It would really help me out. I've so enjoyed making this video. It's always fun to talk about James Bond in various ways. And I'm sure at some point before the end of the year, I'll be doing another Bond movie video at some point. So stick around if you like that, and take care of yourselves.